and today we're going to be talking about the difference between NTSC and PAL and which one you should use. So to start off with, NTSC stands for the National Television Standard Committee, while on the other hand, PAL stands for Phase Alternating Line. Both of these are encoding systems for analog video, which means they're normally used for DVD, or if you fly FPV, they're also used in FPV.
PAL versus NTSC. For YouTubers anywhere near the analog video space, it is the gift that just keeps on giving. And no matter how many videos are made on this subject, there's always room for one more, and people just keep on watching them. Now, the reason that we are opening with this today is because, of course, we're going to be talking about a notorious fly in the ointment in this decades-old, most tribal of discussions. We are, of course, going to be talking about the Brazilian PAL-M system, which is said to be a little bit of both. Now, before we get into it, let's just have a quick look at what the fuss is all about. Now, if we compare the headline figures between NTSC and PAL-M, we can see that actually they look pretty similar. Same field frequency, that unusual 59.94 Hz, or maybe not necessarily for PAL-M. A little bit more about that in a minute. We have the same number of lines, we have almost the same color subcarrier frequency, we have almost the same color space, and the same transmission system. That's the way that it was actually transmitted to the public. Now, if we have a look at our PAL variants over on the right-hand side there, we can see that aside from PAL-N, which is another kind of obscure standard, which I will touch on briefly later in this video, we can see that these things are fundamentally different. Different field range, different number of lines, everything is different about them, and these are looking more like the kind of PAL that people are more familiar with and expecting. So yeah, you can see why PAL-M does tend to create a little bit of confusion and certainly blurs the line between PAL and NTSC. Now, a little bit of background information here. PAL-M, as I said, is a system which is unique to Brazil. It wasn't used in any other country. Now, there are a number of reasons why they might want to choose such a system. For starters, they have a 60 Hz electricity grid, whereas conventional PAL is geared around 50 Hz, so it would have been completely inappropriate. They also have a large stock of 525-line monochrome televisions, so certainly they would want something which was backwards compatible with them, and PAL-M certainly was. Now, additionally, Brazil has more challenging geography than the United States, and certainly these things tend to create signal reflections and phase errors, which tend to be rather problematic for NTSC. So yeah, there certainly are a number of reasons why they might want to choose PAL-M, but none of these really say anything about why it was actually chosen. For example, Canada went with NTSC. There's no reason why Brazil couldn't have done the same thing. Now, a narrative that I came across a number of times when researching this video is that PAL-M was chosen because it would be a system that was unique to Brazil and that would protect Brazilian industry and all of that. Now, there is some truth in this. Brazil is certainly said to be a country which is very protectionist and built on trade barriers and what have you. But to put it into context, those trade barriers are now actually looking relatively modest compared to certain other trade barriers that have been erected at the time that I'm recording this. Now, that's assuming that they are still in place by the time that you're actually watching it. Now, I'm not really sure about this myself. Now, it is definitely true that government policy had a profound impact on shaping the industry, but I don't really think it says much about why PAL-M was actually chosen. Now, there's no question that the choice of PAL-M had a profound impact on television in the South American country. Brazil, being on its own system that nobody else used, created a whole plethora of problems in every nook and cranny of the television production and viewing sectors. And there is this question of whether or not it was really worth it. Were the benefits of PAL-M, did they actually outweigh the drawbacks of NTSC? Now, I don't know myself, but I think it's a question worth asking. Now, there are two companies that PAL-M was definitely worth it for, and of course that is Telefunken and Philips, who are said to have run an advertising campaign in South America celebrating Brazil's choice of PAL-M. And yeah, of course they did. Now, in the making of the series, I've kind of noticed that these two companies had a sort of I scratch your back, you scratch mine kind of relationship, certainly when it came to television. So it's not really surprising for me to hear that they did such a thing. Now, I couldn't actually find any recordings of this advertising campaign, but I would imagine there was probably at least a faint sound of corks popping in the background, because the choice of PAL-M was a massive victory for these companies. They really had a huge financial interest in this actually happening. Telefunken, of course, holding the patent for PAL and collecting royalties on it. And Philips, well, I would imagine they probably had a pretty good deal on when it came to paying those royalties. And of course, its colossal television equipment manufacturing apparatus. Everything from the TV factory to the studio to the transmitter to equipping the TV servicemen to all of the things that people have in their homes. Philips had a product for every need, and of course all available in PAL-M from the minute the ink had dried on the specification. And introducing a novel, patented colour television system, what a fantastic way to pull the rug out from underneath Brazil's homegrown television equipment manufacturing industry, and that's exactly what happened. The introduction of PAL-M pretty much wiped them all out, and from that point onwards everything was foreign. Now, it wasn't just Philips at the party, of course the Japanese moved in eventually as well. Now, there was a significant condition attached to all of this. Of course, these companies would have to set up their own Brazilian factories, they would have to employ Brazilian workers, and they did on a very large scale. And Philips in particular went even further. They even had factories manufacturing actual components that went into televisions, and that's certainly over and above the kind of regional manufacturing that was seen in my own country, where sets were just assembled and all of the components were pretty well important. So yeah, they definitely made a pretty good effort here, but yeah, as I say, it was rather unfortunate for Brazil's own industry, and certainly not everybody was happy with the introduction of PAL-M. Now it's time to dig into the details a little bit more. Now, PAL-M has always had a difficulty about just which club it actually fits into in this, of course, most tribal of debates which burns on internet forums even to this day. Now, for NTSC people, this is a pretty straightforward discussion. It's not compatible with their equipment. It says PAL on it, so what are we even talking about here, right? It's PAL. But PAL people, on the other hand, have always been a bit wary about accepting PAL-M into the PAL club. Now, they would point out that, well, it's not compatible with their equipment either, and if you look at all those headline figures, it's just so ridiculously similar to NTSC. Now, they would actually say that PAL-M belongs in the NTSC club. So, which one is it then? Well, I'll tell you my opinion a bit later on in the video. But for the time being, let's get into one of the first questions, which turns out to be rather difficult, and that's that rather sticky matter of what exactly is the frame rate. Now, in researching this video, I had some difficulty trying to establish what exactly the frame rate was for PAL-M. There's various conflicting sources of information floating around on the internet, and even the relevant specification is annoyingly ambiguous. Now, just for clarification, from now onwards I'm going to refer to field frequency, this being interlaced video. That, of course, is going to be exactly double the frame rate. Now, we have to remind ourselves why NTSC has such an unusual field frequency to begin with, at 59.94. Now, if we go back to the days of monochrome system M, which sometimes you will hear referred to as monochrome NTSC, this equation here ruled the land. That, of course, is that original 60 Hz field frequency multiplied by 525, the number of lines, over 2, the number of fields, and we get 15.75 kilohertz, and everything was just fine and straightforward back in those days. But when colour came along and they added that colour subcarrier, it was quickly found that this math didn't work, and the colour subcarrier was interfering with the sound subcarrier. Now, the reason for that is actually quite complicated, but the crux of it is that when you divide the frequency of the sound subcarrier by the line frequency, you end up with a fraction, 285.714, something or other. To fix the problem, we need to come out with an integer number. Now, there's three things that could be changed: the number of lines, the frame rate, or the sound subcarrier. Now, back in the day, it was deemed the safest thing to just change the frame rate, so that's exactly what they did. And of course, when we plug in our 59.94, we get a nice 286 as the result there. Now, in the context of PAL-M, does this apply? Of course it does. Now, if you look at all the numbers here, none of them actually change when you apply this to PAL-M. So according to the reasoning of NTSC's field frequency, it's exactly the same for PAL-M. Now this all may be somewhat irrelevant because by the time PAL-M went on air in 1972, NTSC's field frequency was set in stone, and because a conversion between PAL-M and NTSC is such a likely thing to happen, realistically it had to be the same as NTSC, otherwise it would have been just yet another mind-boggling difficulty on top of all of the other problems that PAL-M has with compatibility. So yeah, unfortunately that just had to be this way. Now there is actually a way that we can mathematically prove that the field frequency for PAL-M is in fact 59.94, and that's just to do the math in reverse. So if we take the color subcarrier frequency, which you'll see on absolutely everything related to PAL-M, which is 3.575611 megahertz, we divide that by 909 over 4, that is the fixed ratio between the color subcarrier frequency and the line frequency, we come out with 15.734 kilohertz, which of course is a pretty familiar looking number. That's the same for NTSC. We then divide that by 525 over 2, we come out with 59.94. So there you have it, that's the field frequency. So why is the color subcarrier frequency for PAL-M ever so slightly similar to NTSC, but again slightly different? What's going on here? Well, we have to remind ourselves of why these frequencies are chosen to begin with. The idea is so that the color subcarrier carries its information at frequencies which are interleaved with the information carried by the luminance part of the signal, because bear in mind these things are overlapping in the frequency domain and they do need to be able to be separated successfully. So that's the basic idea. The actual mechanism is quite complicated, and we're not going to dwell on that today. Now let's also remind ourselves of where that NTSC field frequency comes from. There it is right there. So I'm not going to dwell on why that was chosen, but that's where it comes from. Now we then multiply that number by 525 over 2 again, and we come out with that line frequency we've seen multiple times before. We then multiply that number by 455 over 2, and then that gives us the NTSC color subcarrier. Why 455? Well, that's just the number that was chosen back when the system was designed. It could have been something different, but that must have been optimum. And why over 2? Well, this goes back to something which we talked about back in video number 19. Now for NTSC, the phase of the color subcarrier and the horizontal sync must meet up every 4 fields, or every 2 frames, so that's why that is. Now straight away we can see that this math doesn't exactly work for PAL-M, because PAL-M, like conventional PAL, the phase of the color subcarrier and horizontal sync only have to meet up every 8 fields, or every 4 frames. So let's go back to the mathematics. So if we have a look at this, then we have that same line frequency, but this time we multiply it by 909 over 4, we then get the PAL-M subcarrier frequency. So that's why it is set that way. And it is a number which is quite convenient, because it's just different enough to NTSC that an NTSC decoder won't attempt to decode it, but it's also similar enough to NTSC that a PAL-M signal will pass through a system M transmission chain without any problems whatsoever. Now, as promised, I'm going to take a minute to talk about PAL-N. Now that is the system that was used in Argentina, Paraguay and Uruguay. Now, like PAL-M, it is quite different to conventional PALs, and it has some numbers about it which actually rather look like NTSC. However, PAL-N is a bit different to PAL-M in that it usually gets to sneak into the PAL club without having too many questions asked. Now, the reason for this is because, of course, it is geared around a 50 Hz electricity system, which those countries were using, and it is actually fundamentally fairly similar to conventional PALs. I guess the main difference about it is that it has been designed to use a significantly smaller amount of bandwidth on the airwaves, because that's really the constraints that those countries were facing. As I say, they couldn't use conventional PAL because they only had 6 MHz channels, like the rest of the American continent, but they did have 50 Hz electricity systems. So yeah, that's what the deal with PAL-N is. Now, I don't think it really deserves its own video because it wasn't really a full PAL format. Unlike PAL-M, where you can buy the full suite of production equipment and do everything end-to-end in PAL-M, for PAL-N, it's not the case. So all the production would have been done in conventional PAL and basically just transcoded to PAL-N at the transmitter. Now, the other reason that PAL-N gets to sneak into the PAL club is because, of course, its VHS tapes are compatible with conventional PAL. VHS recorders of the N standard happen to record it on tape exactly the same way as regular PAL. There's no real reason not to, so yeah, that's just another quite convenient feature for the standard, and certainly if anybody has any old VHS tapes, they can send them abroad to be digitized or whatever. Now next up we're going to do some of those experiments which we always do in my videos. Now these were actually originally slated for my own PAL versus NTSC video, which I ended up shelving because, as I said, there's more than a few of them on YouTube already, and I don't think I really want to add any more. So what we're going to be doing is pitching PAL M against NTSC instead, so pretty much the same experiments I would have otherwise done, but yeah, just on PAL M instead, which I think might be maybe a little bit more interesting. Now, as you could have guessed, these experiments, of course, are going to be around color decoding and hue errors and phase errors and all that stuff which gets so regularly talked about with NTSC. Now, this having been said, to actually witness a hue shift on NTSC the way that it is used today, which is going to be someone plugging a Nintendo 64 into some old television, it's actually ridiculously unlikely that the average person would ever see it. No, you really have to go out of your way to make it happen. Now, of course, that's exactly what we're going to do, so I've got to come up with some kind of contraption which is actually going to cause NTSC to fall over and show the wrong colors. So let's have a look what I came up with. Here it is. Now I call this the NTSC killer, so how does it work and what does it do? Well, let's have a look at this diagram here. Now to create a hue error for NTSC, we have to create a phase error. Now in the case of this particular device, what it's going to be doing is inserting a small delay between the color burst and the visible area of the signal. Now in the real world it's not likely to manifest exactly like this, it's more likely to be a bit more random and spread out across the entire line. But for this device, of course, we're going to be whacking it right in the sweet spot there, and we're going to be creating an absolutely perfect phase error, which of course will be great for this demonstration. So how does it actually work then? Well, we basically take the incoming signal, we then feed it into a sync separator which generates a burst key. Now this is just a pulse which is asserted during the period of the color burst. We then use that to drive a pair of analog switches. During the time of the color burst, the signal passes straight through, but during the time of the visible signal, it is rerouted around a 5-meter loop of coax cable. Why 5 meters? Well, that's just a piece of cable I had, and it seems to do the job pretty nicely. So let's switch it on. Alright, so we are up and running, and yes, it is 6 o'clock in the morning. Recording time is a precious commodity around here. Now for our demonstration today, we're going to be using two different sources. For NTSC, our SMTPE color bars, we're using our trusty PT5210. For PAL-M, we're going to be using this PAL-M Philips generator. Now it's no secret that I do like to collect obscure versions of these things, and this is definitely one of the more obscure ones that I have. Now right now we are running through the NTSC killer, that's the input, the output, and that's the 5-meter loop right there, so we can change that if we want to. Now at the moment, the NTSC killer is disabled, so let's switch it on. Now straight away we can see that our colors are way off. Now some of the bars are still fundamentally the same color, but many of them are now completely different colors. So yeah, that's quite a severe phase error. Now what NTSC people would have done back in the days is they would have reached for their remote controls and busted out with the tint adjustment and tried to correct it just like this. Now if it's especially old television, there might have been a physical knob on the front of the TV, but it's just a menu here. And there we are, so we've basically undone the error inserted by my NTSC killer just by messing with the tint adjustment. Now we can see that my NTSC killer has inserted a rather large phase error because we're really at the extreme end of the adjustment. So yeah, it looks like that 5-meter piece of coax did the job pretty nicely actually. So if we go back to 50 again, which is the middle, and we're now going to try out PAL-M and see what that does. So there's our PAL-M. Now I don't actually think the Philips pattern was publicly used in Brazil, but it definitely was privately used because yeah, this particular unit did actually come from a TV factory. Now of course the NTSC killer is disabled at the moment, so let's switch it on. Now we can see that the hue is exactly the same, but the saturation has actually dropped. So when we switch it on, we have a lower saturation than when it's switched off. And this is just the deal with PAL, that correction mechanism that it has built in. This doesn't come for free. There is, of course, a loss of saturation. Now, the calculation is that this is much less likely to be noticed than a change in hue, and certainly I doubt that anybody who had this kind of error would have ever been reaching for their saturation control. No, they could have done, but that's very unlikely. And also, the phase error that I've inserted here is quite extreme. The loss of saturation wouldn't be quite so much in reality. So anyway, as for whether or not PAL-M is NTSC or PAL, well, there you have it. Certainly, to me, it is definitely PAL. It is doing the thing that PAL is supposed to do. So it's a legitimate form of PAL, it's just a bit different. So just for comparison, I've dialed up an ordinary PAL-G test card from this generator here, so we can see how that looks through the NTSC killer, so let's switch it on. We can see that once again we have that loss of saturation, but no change in hue. Now also interestingly, we've got some colours appearing in the anti-PAL bars, which certainly according to my understanding, that shouldn't be happening. I'm not sure what's going on there. Now, these are a phase error which is introduced in the test signal to check whether or not the set is adjusted correctly, the delay line and what have you, and this would have been quite important inside of a TV factory. They would have looked for these when they were adjusting the glass delay lines, but I'm not sure why they're showing up here. They shouldn't be, because this TV decodes chrominance digitally. It should be a pretty nice actually. So yeah, I don't know, but the PAL mechanism is fundamentally working pretty well. There's no real noticeable change in the tint there. So yeah, I think that's fine. And certainly for me, it's actually pretty cool to see this. I've never actually seen this with my own eyes before. I certainly talked about it a lot in the past. But yeah, anyway, there you have it. Now, one of the things that I really wanted to have for this video was something which would decode PAL-M that was purely analog. Now, it turns out to be an incredibly hard thing to obtain in this part of the world. Now, some time ago, I found this Imtech NTSC decoder on eBay for virtually nothing, so I picked this up with the intention of making this modification, and I've been sitting on this for years and years and years now. But anyway, the idea here is to basically just modify the NTSC decoder in this device to have PAL-M capability, which is quite funny because this thing actually starts out, I believe this actually comes from the United States, and it starts out as a purely PAL decoding item. It has the option of this NTSC decoder. Now, the manufacturer has actually clobbered its ability to decode PAL and added an RGB input for some reason or other, because the output is RGB. And whoever had this last has then reinstated its ability to decode PAL, and then I've of course bodged PAL-M on here, so yeah, this is a rather chaotic item, alright. Now, these sorts of modifications were actually fairly common in Brazil, but what they would be doing is the reverse. So they would start with a PAL-M capable decoder, and then they would maybe just bypass the delay line and change the crystal for an NTSC crystal, which would give them an NTSC decoding item which they could use for watching VHS tapes or maybe a game console or something like that. So it's a much more simple modification than what I've had to do here, because I've had to bodge the delay line back on and wind these inductors and certainly try to tune it. Now, this setup I think probably has quite a bit more parasitic capacitance than is ideal, because I've never been able to get it to tune exactly right. It's a bit less than ideal. Now, the idea here is it plugs into the back of this D-9 cable, which this has got a SCART connection on the other end of it, so that's going to go into the back of my CRT Sony set. Now, I've inadvertently actually built something rather interesting here. This is a badly adjusted PAL receiver, so I think it might be quite fun to introduce this to the NTSC killer and see what happens. So there it is, up and running, and to my eye the colours are okay, but not quite right. And we can see some Hanover bars in some of the colours, so yeah, it does indicate that this isn't properly adjusted, but that's of course the point here. So what happens if we activate the NTSC killer? Well, we can see the hue did actually change a little bit, and we've now got Hanover bars all over the place. Now, more interestingly, we've got colours flashing up in the anti-PAL bars here, and that's indicating that basically the colour correction mechanism of PAL has failed, and there has in fact been a change in hue. It's not massive, certainly nowhere near the extent of what we saw with NTSC, but it has actually happened here. And yeah, this is a point that's often forgotten, is that PAL receivers aren't necessarily always correctly adjusted, and certainly in the case of older models, 1970s units, they often are badly adjusted and don't actually correct the phase errors properly. Well, that's all that I have to cover for today's video, and as always, it's been another interesting dive into another obscure corner of obsolete video technologies. Now, as you might have noticed, I did have some troubles researching the kind of politics side of this. I found the whole process a bit murky and a bit mysterious. Now, maybe there is some information out there which I wasn't able to find, or maybe there is stuff which people know that isn't necessarily on the internet. And certainly, if you know anything, then drop a comment, or maybe just drop me an email or something. I'd certainly be interested to hear a bit more about this. But yeah, as I said, that's all I have for today, and thanks for watching as always. And if you found this interesting, hit subscribe, because of course there are more videos in the pipeline.